A Living Treasure of Longahap, written and read by Jim Bentley. Isolated deep within the scattered land masses of Oceania is a moderately large island called Longahap. The Longahaps follow a matriarchal societal system. Contact with foreigners is rare. Traditionally, the Longahap women were dominant in all facets of community life. They controlled and operated the chiefly system, administered land tenure, cared for and educated the children, gathered seafood, and coordinated a host of other social activities. The men of Longahap had three main traditional roles: carving canoes and building village houses, keeping the plantations productive and supplying the village community with fruit, vegetables, and root crops. They also inherited the warrior role of protecting their people. The concept of marriage between a man and a woman was not present in Longahap, and when it came to social relations, the women were particularly strong. Each month, on the night of the full moon, the women of childbearing age would receive the virile men at the sacred Longa House, a custom-built multi-room structure ordained and sanctioned by the senior medicine women. Amidst the high level of traditional song, dance, and ceremony, the women would choose their male partners with care and reason. The Longa House activity would commence at dusk and end at dawn. A much-needed day of rest followed. This was the main traditional means of procreation of the clans and tribes in each of the 37 villages on Longahap. Periodically, the village leaders would hold the event in cooperation with distant island tribes. This introduced new blood strains to their gene pool. To keep the peace and to prevent men wandering, the chiefs held ad hoc Longa House events whenever they felt it was necessary to calm the human hormones. The system seemed to work for the Longahaps. They continued to live under its influence, lost in time and isolation, off the beaten track in the deep inner Pacific. There came a time many centuries ago when the women leaders of Mana village in South Longahap felt that changes in their traditional governance system were needed. During the widespread, extended spells of peace, the Mana village men turned to frequently drinking green kava into the late hours. The after effects of the potent beverage, heavy hangovers and weariness, hampered their daily duties to the community. This did not please the women chiefs. Poor work performance detrimentally affected village programs. Nutritional patterns were altered, producing undesirable effects on the villagers' health. The women considered this especially serious in the case of their children. Building maintenance slowed down, and new house construction waned. As time elapsed, the village houses for both men and women deteriorated, as did the state of the Longa House. Soon, there were insufficient numbers of canoes available for fishing. Many of the hulls were holed and unusable. This caused a short supply of seafood, the main source of protein. The women leaders of Mana village were extremely concerned. They called a leaders' meeting. Then they arranged a meeting of the village community. The senior women chiefs made presentations relating to the undesirable effects of kava binge drinking. The men listened intently, but presented counter-arguments, stating that the women controlled everything and that kava was the only consoling factor for the men. This enraged the women. They threatened to leave the men and the village. Peace overtures were made by the men through an important resolution. We shall upgrade the village housing, restore the plantations to their former levels of productivity, and ban kava drinking. In addition, the women leaders insisted that the men assume the role of fishermen to restore an ample supply of seafood protein. The men agreed, since they were responsible for canoe construction. However, the men did not fully keep their promises to the women. The plantation food supply was erratic. Building maintenance proceeded at a very slow and inept pace. The canoe builders produced fishing craft in insufficient numbers. Kava drinking into the late hours of the night resumed. When it came to fishing, the men lacked traditional knowledge. They did not possess the skills and techniques required to perform the task efficiently. The women tried to impart their fishing expertise and skills to their men. The men remained unable to provide suitable catches, utilizing the shell hooks and coconut fiber fishing lines of the era. The women held a meeting to discuss the serious situation confronting the Mana village people and their future. The women resolved to give the men one last chance to redeem themselves. The men decided to use technology to catch sufficient seafood to meet the needs of the villagers. After all, said one of the male elders, men are cleverer than women. We can outsmart them at any time. And the men did. They came up with fish traps, turtle traps, octopus traps, crab traps, and lobster traps, which worked very well. But there was one main disadvantage. The traps had to be spread far and wide to encompass a greater number of fishing spots. Small, single-hull canoes were not efficient over long distances. The expert builders designed and constructed a large, twin-hulled canoe they called Diwai Kiliva. It was capable of sailing great distances and coping with rough seas. Fishing became a much more convenient task. An early morning outward journey to set the traps and a return journey at midday to collect them, laden with seafood, became the routine fishing expedition. Mana village life was restored to appropriate status. The women chiefs were impressed. But in traditional song and dance, the leaders related a story for posterity. The men were reminded of the time when the Council of Women gave them one last chance. Comply with their tribal duties or face a future without women. Over the years, the men of Longahap continued to build large sea-going canoes. They also developed more sophisticated means of trapping fish and other marine creatures. But in recent decades, the fishermen noticed a decline in the availability of seafood. This coincided with the era of global warming, which was to have profound effects on the Longahap people's entire lifestyle. Higher levels of ocean water acidity caused by worldwide industrial pollution compounded coral bleaching. Live coral growths the food of many fish species were seriously affected. Plankton levels reduced dangerously. Shellfish and crustacean numbers depleted markedly. The fish traps of Longahap, although brilliantly designed, were frequently retrieved empty. The men were at first surprised at the reduction of marine bounty, then after an extended period of empty traps, angered. The women complained that their children were not receiving proper nutrition. The men were exasperated and frustrated. Stories of inadequate fishing techniques were told in village meetings. The disgruntled fishermen resumed their night kava binge drinking sessions. The women complained. The men reacted by neglecting plantation and house maintenance duties. The lifestyle of the Mana village people once again drastically deteriorated. The women chiefs closed the Longahap. The men scoffed at them and warned that they would search elsewhere for willing female partners. The women commenced planting vegetables on flat, easily tilled land close to the village settlement. After a period of learning and enduring taunts by the men, the women gardeners achieved a semblance of success. But global warming brought sea level rise. Higher spring tides ruined the land by flooding the low-lying garden areas with salt water. The men laughed, while the women worried about the welfare of their children. The women were additionally insulted when, in blatant disregard of the chiefs, the men occupied the sacred Longahap by force and used the premises for kava drinking. Prolonged kava binges continued on a nightly basis. As a result, the men slumbered long into the daylight hours. The village lifestyle deteriorated further. The women chiefs decided that the tribe had reached a point of no return. One bright, humid afternoon, when the sun had passed its zenith in the clear Pacific sky, the dreary-eyed men awoke to realize that their women and children had vanished. The women chiefs of Mana village had led the mothers and children away on the vast Pacific Ocean. They had boarded the men's large twin-hulled fishing canoe and sailed a course to an unknown destination. The Mana village men panicked. The sons and daughters they loved and cherished had been taken away by the women they admired and loved. The anxious, perplexed men searched the entire village area without success. Several of the younger men ran the considerably long distances to the villages on each side of Mana. They returned tired and exhausted, without a hint of information. Some of the men paddled the single-hull shallow-water fishing canoes out to sea in the hope of seeing the great canoe at sail. There was no sign of the deep-sea vessel. The devastated Mana men assembled to discuss their dire predicament. Many cursed the women chiefs. Others cursed the kava binge drinking. There was great disagreement about immediate objectives, a plan of action, or how they should sustain themselves as a group. The men were traditionally used to being led. Tempers flared in discussion. Disagreements led to physical confrontation. They resumed kava binge drinking to drown their sorrows and to calm their angry personal spirits. The men of the Mana tribe descended into a period of deep self-pity. They had lost their tribal treasures, the women and children they had loved and taken for granted. Without a guiding system of governance, self-pity turned into actions of violence. Delusion led to debauchery. The Mana men raided other villages to kidnap women and steal foodstuff. This led to tribal wars. Many Mana men were killed. Other villages joined the fighting by sending their warriors to support neighboring village chiefs. The Mana men migrated to the bush and fought on. The battles lasted longer than a year of full moons. More women were stolen. Fatal skirmishes continued. Eating on the run took its toll. A diet without seafood, green vegetables, and root crops weakened the Mana warriors. They continued to be killed. Their numbers drew dangerously low until there were only 40 surviving members. Close to extinction, the tribe returned to Mana village. On a wind-swept rainy day, about a week before the appearance of the full moon, sails were seen on the horizon. As the craft drew near, the Mana men grew curious and went down to the seashore to meet the visitors. They were surprised to see their senior woman chief and a contingent of their young sons. They had sailed the twin-hulled vessel across the great ocean to Longahap. The 40 Mana survivors were taken on board the great Diwaikiliva canoe and transported to their women and children, now settled on a distant, fertile volcanic island. A Spanish anthropologist visited the new site of the Mana tribe while exploring the inner Pacific. He recorded in his diary that the Mana people called their new homeland La Isla de Tesoro Personas, the island of treasured people. He reported that the Mana men now regard their women and children as living treasures to be protected, cared for, and nurtured with great love and affection.